A foreign millionaire buys a single mother as his wife to get revenge on his ex-lover. A few days later, he has to leave everything behind and return to his homeland. The evening sun hung low over the city, spilling its golden light through the cracked blinds of Kathleen's apartment. Dust motes danced in the air, and somewhere in the background, a faint melody from a neighbor's old radio mingled with the muffled laughter of children outside. Inside, the small, dimly lit space, Kathleen sat at the edge of a faded couch, her hands clenched tightly around the hem of her threadbare sweater. With their identical dark curls shimmering in the sun's last rays, Ashley and Amy sprawled on the living room floor. The twins giggled softly, engrossed in a game that required more imagination than toys. Kathleen smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed the exhaustion she refused to show. The girls had drawn stick figures on torn sheets of paper, pretending they were superheroes. To them, this tiny apartment was a fortress, and their mother was their protector. Kathleen let them believe it, though the truth was a heavy weight pressing against her chest. She caught a glimpse of the stack of unopened envelopes on the coffee table. Their edges curled slightly, some yellowed with time. Electricity bills, water bills. The thick, ominous envelope bearing the red stamp, "Final Notice," caught her attention. She forced herself to look away. "Mum?" Ashley's voice, small and curious, pulled Kathleen back to the room. The girl held up a stick figure she had drawn, her wide brown eyes sparkling with pride. "This one's you. You've got superpowers. See? You're flying." Kathleen's throat tightened. She reached out and gently took the paper, tracing the jagged lines with her fingers. "Flying, huh? I'll need that to chase after you too when you're causing trouble." Ashley and Amy erupted in laughter, and for a moment, the sound eased the ache in Kathleen's chest. But the reprieve was brief. A sharp knock at the door shattered the fragile peace, and her breath hitched. The sound was heavy, deliberate, too deliberate. "Stay here," she whispered to the girls, her voice calm but firm. She rose and moved toward the door, her bare feet silent against the worn carpet. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling before she turned it. The man on the other side filled the doorway. His tailored suit, though slightly rumpled, spoke of authority. His face was sharp and weathered, his eyes calculating. Behind him stood another man, broader and less refined, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. "Miss Duarte?" the first man began, his tones smooth but cold. "We've been patient." Kathleen swallowed hard. I know. I just need more time." The man tilted his head, a predator sizing up prey. "Time's run out. Your father's debts persist even after his departure. You know that." Her nails dug into her palms, the pain grounding her. "I'm trying to pay. Please, The second man stepped forward, his presence suffocating in the narrow hallway. "Trying isn't effective enough," he growled. "We don't want to come back here, Ms. Duarte. Make sure we don't have to." Kathleen nodded quickly, her voice stuck in her throat. She stepped back, shutting the door against their lingering presence. The moment the latch clicked, her knees buckled, and she gripped the wall to steady herself. "Mum." Amy's voice was tentative now, her face peeking around the corner. Ashley wasn't far behind, clutching her sister's hand. Kathleen straightened, smoothing her sweater as if that could erase what had just happened. She turned, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's fine, sweethearts. Just someone asking for directions." The girls exchanged glances, unconvinced, but said nothing. They returned to their game, their laughter quieter now. Kathleen sank back onto the couch, her eyes drifting to the pile of bills once more. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its sound louder than usual in the suffocating silence. She thought of her father, of the promises he had made and broken. The weight of his sins now rested squarely on her shoulders, threatening to crush her. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. There had to be a way. There always was, wasn't there? But as the shadows lengthened in the room, the answers felt more distant than ever. All she had was a growing desperation, a gnawing fear that no amount of willpower could quiet. For Ashley and Amy, she would endure anything. She was willing to cross boundaries she had vowed never to cross. The rain came lightly at first, speckling the smudged kitchen window with droplets, then gathered into a steady rhythm that blurred the glow of streetlights outside. Kathleen stood by the sink, staring at the chipped porcelain bowl in her hands, as if it could offer answers. Behind her, the hum of a cheap fan barely held back the thick warmth of the room. Ashley and Amy had fallen asleep on the couch, their small bodies tangled together beneath a thin blanket, their breaths even and untroubled. Her phone buzzed against the counter, the screen lighting up with a name she hadn't seen in years. Rosa. Kathleen hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen, but answered. "Rosa?" she said, her voice low. "Kathleen." Rosa's tone was tight, wary, the kind of voice people used when stepping over broken glass. "I heard about the mess with your father." Kathleen clenched her jaw, her knuckles whitening around the bowl. "News travels fast." "I didn't want to call," Rosa admitted, "but I couldn't ignore it. I know what those men are capable of." "Then you know I'll figure it out," Kathleen snapped, her words sharper than intended. Rosa paused. "You've always been strong, but this isn't just about you anymore. What happens if they come back? What if—" "They won't," Kathleen cut in. "I'll find a way." Rosa hesitated again, but then her voice softened, almost reluctant. "There's something you could do. It's unconventional." Kathleen's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "We call it the auction," Rosa said, her words resonating deeply. "Exclusive, private. Men with excessive wealth often seek companionship." The room felt colder, despite the stifling air. Kathleen let the silence hang, hoping Rosa would take it back, say it was a bad joke. "I understand how it sounds," Rosa hurriedly continued, "but it's legal, discreet. Some women walk away with enough to change their lives, enough to protect their families." Kathleen let out a bitter laugh, setting the bowl down carefully, as if it might shatter under her trembling hands. "You think I could— What? Sell myself to strangers?" "I'm saying it's a choice," Rosa said gently. "A terrible one, but a choice. And if it comes to keeping those girls safe—" Kathleen's throat tightened. Her eyes darted to the living room, where Ashley had stirred in her sleep, mumbling something incoherent. "I'll think about it," Kathleen said, her voice barely audible. The rain stopped sometime after midnight, leaving the streets glistening under the pale light of a flickering street lamp. Kathleen sat at the kitchen table, an untouched cup of tea cooling between her palms. Rosa's words churned in her mind, fighting for space with the memories of the debt collector's hard stares and thinly veiled threats. Her stomach churned at the thought of the auction, but the alternative was unimaginable. She could still hear the man's gravelly voice from earlier that day. It'd be a shame if anything happened to those little girls. Her fingers tightened around the mug as she closed her eyes, imagining every possible outcome. The auction was a gamble, a dangerous one, but so was doing nothing. She thought of Ashley and Amy, how they clung to her when the world felt too big, too scary. She pondered how they regarded her as if she possessed all the answers and could solve any problem. The idea of failing them, of letting her father's mistakes seep into their lives, felt like a weight dragging her under. The soft padding of small feet interrupted her reverie. Amy appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes with one hand, her favorite stuffed rabbit dangling from the other. "Mommy," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. Kathleen forced a smile, opening her arms. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Amy climbed into her lap, pressing her head against Kathleen's chest. "I had a terrible dream," she whispered. "What was it about?" Amy shrugged, her tiny fingers playing with the frayed hem of Kathleen's sweater. She whispered, "It's the man from today. He was yelling, but you weren't there." Kathleen's heart clenched. She stroked Amy's hair, willing her voice to stay steady. "It was just a dream, baby. I'm not going anywhere." Amy looked up at her, eyes wide with trust. "Promise?" Kathleen hesitated, then kissed her forehead. "I promise." By dawn, she had made her decision. Something fiercer drowned out the guilt that sat heavy in her chest. Resolve. She dialed Rosa's number, the early morning light creeping into the kitchen like an uninvited guest. "I'll do it," she said, when Rosa answered. Her voice was steady, even as her hands shook. "Tell me how it works." Rosa exhaled on the other end, her relief palpable. "I'll send you the details." "But Kathleen..." "What?" "This isn't forever. It's just a way out." Kathleen hung up, staring at the phone in her hand. The promise she had made to Amy echoed in her mind. She didn't have the luxury of forever, only the chance to make it through the next day, the next week, the next month. And if this was the cost, she would pay it. For them. Always for them. The dress was too tight. Kathleen tugged at the fabric around her waist, her hands trembling as the zipper inched higher. The mirror reflected a stranger, her usual loose sweaters and worn jeans replaced by a fitted, deep red gown that Rosa insisted would turn heads. Kathleen couldn't see the allure. All she saw was her own anxiety, stretched thin over sharp cheekbones and eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. "Stop fidgeting," Rosa said, her voice soft but firm. She stepped behind Kathleen, gently guiding her hands away. "You'll ruin it." Kathleen met Rosa's gaze in the mirror. "I don't belong there." Rosa's expression softened, her fingers brushing a stray curl from Kathleen's face. "You're doing this for them, remember? Ashley and Amy. That's all that matters." The mention of her daughters tightened the knot in Kathleen's stomach. She nodded, swallowing the rising lump in her throat. Rosa squeezed her shoulder. "Hold your head high. Confidence sells, even if you have to fake it." Kathleen tried to smile, but it faltered. Rosa's eyes softened further, and she leaned in, her voice barely raised above a whisper. "You're stronger than you think, Kathleen. They'll see it too." Kathleen closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. When she opened them again, the woman in the mirror stood taller, her resolve stitched into every seam of the dress. The setting was a lavish and oppressive gilded cage. Kathleen stepped through the towering double doors, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Crystal chandeliers cast fragmented light onto the room, where well-dressed men sipped champagne from crystal flutes and women in tailored gowns moved with practiced grace. Wealth and power perfumed the air, pressing against Kathleen's chest like an iron weight. She smoothed the fabric of her borrowed dress, its deep red color a sharp contrast to her pale, trembling hands. Rosa had insisted it would make her stand out, but Kathleen felt like an imposter, wrapped in someone else's life. The murmurs in the crowd seemed louder as she moved, and she imagined every pair of eyes on her, dissecting her for flaws she could no longer hide. Across the room, Samuel Batista observed from a shadowed corner. Despite his understated, tailored black suit and the peacocking of the other men, his presence commanded attention. His sharp jawline and unreadable expression made him look more like a marble statue than a man, cold and unyielding. A glass of untouched whiskey sat on the table beside him, the amber liquid catching the light as his fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. Samuel wasn't here for entertainment. His gaze moved methodically across the room, landing briefly on each woman before moving on. He didn't need companionship, nor did he crave distraction. He was here for a purpose, one that burned in his chest every time he thought of Linda Wheeler and the betrayal that had turned his life into a series of calculated moves. When his eyes landed on Kathleen, they lingered. She wasn't like the others. There was no polished veneer, no air of entitlement. Despite her squared shoulders, the tension in her jaw revealed her unease. She didn't belong here, yet something about her tugged at the edges of his resolve. "Interesting," he murmured, almost to himself. Someone called Kathleen's name. She felt her stomach lurch, but her feet carried her forward. The stage felt larger than it had when she'd seen it earlier, and the bright spotlight was blinding. She clasped her hands in front of her to stop their trembling and tried to focus on the floor beneath her feet rather than the sea of eyes watching her. "She's new," someone murmured from the crowd, the words rippling with curiosity. "Unpolished," another said, a trace of disdain in his voice. Samuel leaned forward slightly, the movement imperceptible to anyone not watching him closely. The auctioneer's voice cut through the room, smooth and confident. "Our next participant, Kathleen Duarte. A rare find, ladies and gentlemen." His practiced smile never faltered. "Let's begin the bidding at 100,000. The numbers rose quickly, the voices blending together in a cacophony that made Kathleen's head spin. She kept her gaze fixed on a point at the back of the room, willing herself not to falter. 500,000, someone called, drawing murmurs from the crowd. Samuel's voice sliced through the noise, low and firm. 1 million. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward him, but Samuel didn't flinch. His expression remained impassive, his gaze locked on Kathleen as though she were a puzzle he was determined to solve. The auctioneer quickly recovered, his enthusiasm increasing. 1 million. Going once, going twice. Sold. The gavel struck, and the sound echoed like a final note in a symphony. Kathleen exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, but the relief was short-lived. They ushered her off the stage into a small, dimly lit room where the air felt sucked out of her lungs. Rosa appeared briefly, her expression unreadable. "You're with Mr. Batista," she whispered. Before Kathleen could respond, the door opened and Samuel stepped inside. His presence filled the room, though he moved with the kind of deliberate ease that spoke of control. He closed the door behind him, his eyes scanning her carefully, not with desire, but something sharper. "Kathleen," he said, his voice smooth but distant. She nodded, her throat too dry to speak. "I don't care for pretense, so let me be clear," Samuel began, stepping closer. "You're here because I have a use for you. This is a transaction, nothing more. Do you understand?" Kathleen swallowed hard, nodding again. "For the next 2 months, you'll accompany me as my fiancé," Samuel continued. His words were cold, each syllable precise. "You'll follow my lead, and in return, you'll leave with enough money you want. Whatever you're hiding, keep it buried, for your sake." The door clicked shut, leaving Kathleen alone. Her knees buckled slightly, and she gripped the back of the chair for support. She had survived the first hurdle, but the road ahead felt darker than ever. The estate loomed like a fortress against the backdrop of rolling hills. Kathleen followed silently as the car wound up the cobblestone driveway, the tires crunching softly. The mansion that greeted her was sprawling yet eerily quiet, its ivy-covered walls illuminated by the warm glow of wrought-iron lanterns. She stepped out hesitantly, clutching her modest bag as though it might shield her from the weight of this foreign world. Samuel Batista was waiting just inside the grand entrance, his posture as rigid as the marble columns framing him. He gestured for her to follow without a word, leading her through a labyrinth of corridors, each one echoing the sound of her uncertain footsteps. Finally, they entered a spacious library, its walls lined with books that looked untouched. A fire crackled faintly in the hearth, its warmth doing little to ease the chill in Kathleen's chest. Samuel took a seat behind a mahogany desk, motioning for her to sit opposite him. He spoke first, his tone clipped and businesslike. "For the next 2 months, you will act as my fiancée. Publicly, you will play the part convincingly. Privately, our arrangement will remain strictly professional." Kathleen's fingers curled into her lap, her nails digging into her palms. "And after 2 months?" she asked, her voice steady but quiet. "You leave," Samuel replied, leaning back slightly. His gaze was calculating, his tone almost dismissive. "You have enough money to solve your situation." Kathleen bit the inside of her cheek, a habit she'd picked up in moments of doubt. "And what do you expect from me?" "Obedience." The word fell sharply, leaving no room for interpretation. "You will act as my fiancé. You'll attend events with me, meet people, and do everything required to make this believable." His dark eyes locked onto hers, unflinching. "In return, you'll walk away with enough money to handle whatever mess you're in. Beyond that, there are no expectations." Kathleen bristled at his cold tone, but she kept her face neutral. "And if I fail?" Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You won't," he replied, his voice piercing through the air like a blade. "I don't tolerate failure." She hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "What exactly are you trying to achieve with this performance?" "That's none of your concern." Samuel's tone carried a finality that dared her to push further. For a moment, the room felt suffocating. Kathleen's mind raced with questions she didn't dare voice, but the image of Ashley and Amy sleeping peacefully was enough to steel her resolve. She nodded slowly. "We do." Samuel's eyes lingered on her for a beat longer than necessary, his expression unreadable. "Good. Deborah will show you to your room. Rest now. Tomorrow we begin." He rose abruptly, signaling the end of the conversation. As Kathleen stood to leave, she hesitated. "Why me?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Samuel paused, his back to her. "You fit the role," he said evenly, though his voice softened just enough to suggest more. "Nothing more." He left without another word, his footsteps fading into the vastness of the estate. Deborah, the old housekeeper, appeared moments later, her demeanor brisk but not unkind. "Come on," she said, motioning for Kathleen to follow. They ascended a sweeping staircase and stopped at a door near the end of the hall. "This is you," Deborah said, opening the door to reveal a bedroom that looked like something from a magazine. The bed was massive, draped in soft linens, and the windows overlooked the estate's sprawling gardens. "Get some sleep," Deborah added, her voice softer now. "You'll need it." Kathleen nodded, offering a faint smile before stepping inside. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it as she took in her surroundings. The opulence felt more suffocating than comforting, each detail a reminder of the bargain she'd struck. She moved to the window, staring out at the darkened gardens below. The weight of Samuel's words lingered in her mind, each one measured and precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation. He'd made it clear, she was a pawn in his game, nothing more. But as she traced the faint reflection of her face in the glass, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Samuel Batista than his carefully crafted mask. And she couldn't decide if that thought was comforting or terrifying. 1 million is a lot of money. What would you do with it if you had it? Leave your information in the comments section below. We'd love to hear from you. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the dining room. casting golden patterns onto the polished floors. Kathleen sat at the long oak table, feeling dwarfed by its size and the sprawling estate that surrounded her. They laid out a breakfast spread fit for royalty before her. Fresh pastries, ripe fruit, steaming coffee, but her appetite was absent. Samuel entered the room silently, his presence commanding attention. He wore a crisp white shirt rolled to the elbows, exposing strong forearms, and his dark hair was still damp from an early shower. Without a word, he took the seat at the head of the table, unfolding the newspaper in his hands. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the faint clink of cutlery against china. Kathleen busied herself with pouring coffee, her movements slow and deliberate. "You're settling in?" Samuel's voice broke the quiet, though his eyes remained on the paper. Kathleen hesitated, startled by the unexpected question. "It's different," she admitted carefully. Samuel folded the newspaper and set it aside, his gaze finally meeting hers. "You'll adjust," he said flatly, though there was no malice in his tone. She nodded, unsure of how to respond. As the days passed, Kathleen began to understand the rhythm of the estate. The mornings were quiet, marked by brief encounters with Samuel before he retreated to his study. We spent the afternoons exploring the grounds, which included endless gardens, a shimmering pool, and a shaded path winding through a grove of ancient oaks. Despite its beauty, the estate felt lonely, its vastness amplifying the absence of warmth. One afternoon, Kathleen wandered into the library. The dimly lit room filled the air with the scent of aged leather and paper. She traced her fingers along the spines of the books, marveling at the collection. "Do you read?" Samuel's voice startled her, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway. "Sometimes," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "When I have the time." He stepped inside, his movements deliberate. "This is my mother's collection," he said, gesturing to the shelves. She believed books could solve anything. Kathleen studied his expression, noticing the subtle shift in his demeanor. There was a softness there, fleeting but unmistakable. "Did they?" she asked, her tone light but curious. Samuel's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Not everything," he said, before turning his attention to the nearest shelf. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the tension between them easing just enough to feel natural. That evening, over dinner, Samuel spoke again, his tone less guarded. "You handled the meeting today well." Kathleen glanced up, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you," she said cautiously. "It's important to remain composed," he continued. "This is particularly crucial in this social environment. People notice cracks." "I've had practice," she replied, her voice tinged with irony. Samuel raised an eyebrow, intrigued, but refrained from pressing further. Instead, he poured himself another glass of wine, the faint clink of the bottle against the glass, filling the brief silence. As the days turned into weeks, these small moments of connection began to accumulate. These moments could take the form of a shared joke during a tense meeting, a quiet conversation in the garden, or an unspoken understanding during a public event. Samuel's icy exterior remained intact, but Kathleen caught glimpses of something warmer beneath the surface, a flicker of humanity that made her question the man she thought she understood. Samuel, too, found himself drawn to her resilience. She moved through his world with quiet determination, never complaining, never faltering. It unsettled him, this growing admiration for someone he had intended to use as a tool in his elaborate game. One night, as Kathleen stood on the balcony overlooking the estate, Samuel joined her. The cool night air brushed against her skin, and she wrapped her arms around herself. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice low. She turned to him, startled by the question. "This Arrangement. Samuel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Kathleen considered her answer carefully. "I regret needing it," she admitted, "but not what it's for." Samuel's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Instead, they stood in silence, the stars above them casting a faint glow. For the first time, the distance between them felt smaller, the walls they had both built showing the faintest cracks. Neither of them spoke of it, but in that quiet moment, a fragile bond began to form, unspoken yet undeniable. The fire in the library burned low, casting flickering shadows that danced along the walls, lined with rows of pristine, untouched books. Kathleen sat curled in a leather armchair, a blanket draped over her legs, her gaze fixed on the flames. She had taken to spending quiet evenings here, finding solace in the hushed stillness of the room. Samuel's entrance was as quiet as ever, but his presence commanded the air, making it heavier. She looked up, startled as he crossed the threshold. He carried a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling lazily with his movements. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You didn't." Kathleen adjusted the blanket, her posture stiffening slightly. Samuel settled into the chair opposite hers, his gaze fixed on the fire. They stood silent, not uncomfortable but charged, as if waiting for each other to speak. "You asked me once why I chose you," he said finally, his voice low, almost contemplative. Kathleen turned her head slightly, surprised. "And you didn't answer?" He smirked faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't believe in sharing more than necessary." He swirled the whiskey in his glass, his gaze distant. "But perhaps it's time for exceptions." The confession that followed was measured and deliberate, each word chosen with care. Samuel spoke of Linda Wheeler, the woman who had once held his trust and shattered it with her betrayal. He told Kathleen of discovering her affair with a fellow actor, the lies that unraveled their life together, and the cold, calculated resolve that had taken root in him ever since. "She made me a fool," he admitted, his voice laced with bitterness. "And I don't forgive foolishness, not in others, and certainly not in myself." Kathleen listened, her hands gripping the edge of the blanket. She saw for the first time the cracks in his carefully crafted armor. Samuel wasn't the unyielding marble figure he portrayed. He was a man whose pain ran deep, his wounds hidden beneath layers of control. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, the sincerity in her voice breaking through the tension. Samuel's gaze flicked to her, sharp but unreadable. "Don't be. It's in the past." Yet his expression betrayed him. For all his insistence, the past lingered, shaping every calculated move he made. As the conversation waned, Samuel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His eyes fell briefly to her lap, and he froze. The blanket had shifted, revealing the faint stretch marks on Kathleen's stomach. They were subtle, visible only in the firelight, but unmistakable. Samuel straightened, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask, but the question hung heavy in the air, a quiet tension simmering between them. Kathleen noticed his gaze and quickly pulled the blanket higher, her face flushing with a mix of shame and fear. She averted her eyes, focusing on the fire as though it could shield her from his scrutiny. Samuel said nothing, but his demeanor shifted. He rose abruptly, his movements brisk. "It's late," he said, his tone returning to its usual coolness. "You should rest." Kathleen nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "Good night." He paused at the doorway, his back to her. For a moment it seemed he might speak again, but instead he left, his footsteps fading into the hall. That night, Kathleen lay awake in her bed, the soft sheets doing little to comfort her. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of what Samuel might have seen, and what he might suspect. Rosa is watching the kids. She thought of Ashley and Amy. Their laughter filled the tiny apartment they once called home. She thought of the sacrifices she had made to protect them, and the lies she now carried to shield them from this world. Samuel's gaze haunted her, piercing and curious. He hadn't confronted her, but she could feel the weight of his unspoken questions. In the quiet darkness, Kathleen felt the walls around her fragile truths begin to crack, the secrets she had worked so hard to bury, threatening to rise. And yet, amid her fear, she couldn't shake the memory of Samuel's voice, the vulnerability that had slipped through his otherwise impenetrable facade. Perhaps they were both hiding, their secrets woven into the fabric of their fragile bond. And perhaps in the cracks that formed, something else might begin to grow. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the drawing room, illuminating Kathleen's restless figure as she paced back and forth. Her hands twisted the hem of her sweater, her mind warring between fear and resolve. The night's lingering tension had been unbearable. Samuel's unspoken curiosity pressing against her, like a weight she could no longer carry. By the time Samuel appeared, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, Kathleen had steeled herself. She sat down in the armchair closest to the window, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He paused upon entering, his sharp gaze sweeping over her before he approached. "You wanted to speak with me?" "Yes," Kathleen said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Samuel took the seat opposite her, resting his forearms on his knees. "I'm listening." Kathleen hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, with a deep breath, she began. "I haven't been entirely honest with you." Samuel's expression remained neutral, though a flicker of something, interest perhaps, passed through his eyes. "I'm not—" She paused, her throat tightening. "I'm not the person you think I am. Her voice faltered, but she pushed on. "I have children, 2 daughters, Ashley and Amy. They're everything to me." The words hang in the air, heavy and unyielding. Kathleen braced herself for anger, for judgment, but Samuel's reaction was neither. He leaned back slightly, his gaze narrowing as he processed her confession. "Go on," he said quietly, his tone unreadable. She swallowed hard, her hands gripping the armrests of the chair. "My father left us with nothing but debts. Debts I've been struggling to pay off. The auction was my final opportunity to ensure their safety. I wanted to give them a life that I couldn't provide for them otherwise." Her voice cracked, and she looked down, ashamed. "I didn't tell you because I thought it would ruin everything." The silence that followed was suffocating. Kathleen forced herself to meet his gaze, prepared for the worst. Samuel's expression was inscrutable, his dark eyes fixed on hers. Then, to her surprise, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You did this for them," he said, his voice soft but firm. It wasn't a question. Kathleen nodded, her throat too tight for words. Samuel exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before returning to her. "You made a choice. It was a challenging decision, but it took courage." Her breath stopped. She had expected condemnation, dismissal, but not this, not understanding. "I'm not angry," Samuel continued, his tone measured. "I don't see weakness in what you did, only strength." Tears welled in Kathleen's eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you," she whispered. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxing slightly. "It doesn't change anything about our arrangement," he said, though his voice lacked its usual edge. "But it does change how I see you." Kathleen frowned slightly, unsure of what he meant. "I thought I understood you," he admitted, his gaze steady. "But I didn't." Not fully. For the first time since their agreement began, Kathleen saw something new in Samuel's eyes. Respect. That evening, their dynamic shifted subtly. During dinner, their usual silence gave way to a small, genuine conversation. Samuel asked about Ashley and Amy, what they were like, what they loved, and Kathleen answered with quiet pride, her face lighting up as she spoke of her daughters. In turn, Samuel shared fragments of his own past, his guarded demeanor softening just enough for Kathleen to catch a glimpse of the man beneath the armor. He spoke of his childhood in Portugal, the sprawling vineyards his family once owned, and the mother who taught him to value hard work over privilege. By the time the evening ended, there was a newfound ease between them, a fragile but growing trust that neither dared to acknowledge outright. As Kathleen lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Now that she had revealed the truth, she no longer felt alone in this gilded cage. And Samuel, as he stood by the window of his own room, sipping his whiskey, found his thoughts returning to Kathleen. Her resilience, her quiet strength, it unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite understand. For the first time since Linda's betrayal, he began to question the morality of his plans. Revenge had always been his driving force, but now, something else was taking root. He couldn't ignore it. Linda Wheeler leaned back against the plush leather of her penthouse lounge, the city lights glittering like jewels through the floor-to-ceiling windows. A glass of champagne dangled loosely in her manicured fingers, her crimson nails catching the dim light. Across from her, a group of equally glamorous acquaintances chattered, their voices dripping with gossip. "Have you heard?" One of them spoke, her lips curling into a sly smile. "Samuel's got someone new. A fiancé, apparently." Linda's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, though her expression remained composed. "A fiancé," she repeated, feigning mild amusement. "How quaint." "They say she's no one special," another chimed in. "Just some woman he picked up out of nowhere. No family name, no connections." Linda's smile hardened at the edges, her mind already whirring. She swirled her glass, her voice turning icy. "I wonder what poor soul he's decided to entertain this time." Laughter filled the room, but Linda's thoughts had strayed elsewhere. Later that night, alone in her study, she picked up her phone, dialing with precision. "I want everything," she said, when the line connected. "Her name is Kathleen Duarte. Leave nothing uncovered." The following morning, Linda sat at her desk, sifting through the preliminary results delivered by her investigator. A single photograph of Kathleen holding the hand of a young girl caught her eye, her lips curling into a slow, victorious smile. "Oh, Samuel," she murmured to herself, "you've made this too easy." Linda's intervention initially manifested as a thick envelope that arrived at Samuel's office. The pristine white paper bore no markings other than his name, in elegant black script. Samuel's jaw tightened as he opened it, the contents spilling across his desk, a collection of photographs, documents, and typed notes, each one meticulously curated to dissect Kathleen's life. The photographs were innocuous at first, shots of her walking along the estate's grounds, sitting on the balcony. But then came the ones from her past. Images of her in her modest apartment, of Ashley and Amy playing in a small yard, of her handing cash to what could only be debt collectors. Beneath the photos was a note, brief but cutting. "Is this the woman you think fits your world?" Samuel didn't need a signature to know it was Linda's work. He stared at the evidence, his mind churning. Yet, instead of the anger Linda had likely expected, there was something else. Resolve. He swept the papers back into the envelope and tossed it into a drawer, locking it away. Kathleen noticed Samuel's demeanor shift over the next few days. He was quieter, more measured, though his gaze lingered on her longer than before. She sensed the tension, but his silence kept her questions at bay. Then the bomb dropped. On a Monday morning, the headlines began to appear on tabloids and gossip sites. Samuel Batista's fiancée exposed, the scandalous past of Kathleen Duarte. The articles were ruthless. They painted Kathleen as a desperate gold digger, a woman who had used her beauty to ensnare a billionaire while hiding the truth of her life as a single mother with a tainted reputation. By noon, the news had reached every corner of Samuel's world. Reporters camped outside the estate, cameras flashing at anyone who passed through the gates. Kathleen remained in her room, the burden of humiliation overwhelming her like an uncontrollable storm. Samuel found her on the balcony that evening, her shoulders hunched as she stared into the darkening sky. She didn't turn when he approached, her voice breaking the silence instead. "I suppose this is the part where you tell me I've embarrassed you," she said, her tone bitter but defeated. Samuel stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Is that what you think?" She turned then, her eyes brimming with tears. "What else should I contemplate? Everything they wrote is now publicly available. My daughters are the center of my life. I'm exactly what they say I am. And now, you're dragged into it." Samuel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "You're wrong." Kathleen blinked, taken aback. "What?" "You're not what they say you are," he said firmly. "You're a mother who made impossible choices to protect her children. Despite the overwhelming odds against her, you persevered, and you're certainly not an embarrassment." She searched his face, looking for any trace of insincerity, but found none. "I've already started dealing with this," Samuel continued. "We are currently taking legal action against Linda. She overstepped, and she'll pay for it." Kathleen shook her head, her voice trembling. "You don't have to do this. You don't owe me." Samuel cut her off, his voice soft but unyielding. "This isn't about what I owe. This is about what's right." For a moment, they stood in silence, the sounds of the estate muted around them. Then Samuel took a step closer, his gaze locking with hers. "Kathleen, listen to me," he said. "What Linda did was calculated, cruel. But I won't let her tear you down. You've endured enough." Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she quickly brushed them away. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she admitted. Samuel hesitated, his expression softening. "I see you," he said simply, "and you deserve better." The following day, Samuel held a press conference. Standing at the front of a crowded room, he addressed the rumors with an unwavering tone. "The attacks on Kathleen Duarte are baseless and defamatory," he said. "Neither her past nor the narrative that those seeking to harm her are spinning define her. We have already initiated legal action against those responsible for this smear campaign. I will not stand by and let lies dictate the truth." His words sent a ripple through the room, the cameras flashing as he left without taking questions. Back at the estate, Kathleen watched the broadcast from her room, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. When Samuel returned, she met him at the door, her voice quiet, but resolute. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." Samuel nodded, his expression softening. "This isn't over," he warned. But neither are we. For the first time, Kathleen felt the full weight of his words, not as a command, but as a promise. The sound of laughter filled the modest playroom, where Ashley and Amy sat cross-legged on the floor, building towers with colorful wooden blocks. Kathleen hovered near the doorway, her heart racing as Samuel approached the scene. He carried himself with his usual composed confidence, yet there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes as he glanced at Kathleen before stepping into the room. Ashley was the first to notice him. "Are you Mr. Samuel?" she asked, her small face lighting up with curiosity. Samuel crouched to meet her gaze, his suit a sharp contrast to the scattered toys on the floor. "That's right," he replied, his voice soft but steady. "And you must be Ashley." Amy peeked out from behind her sister, clutching a stuffed rabbit. "That's me," she whispered shyly. Samuel smiled, his expression gentle. "It's wonderful to meet you both. Your mum has told me a lot about you." Ashley tilted her head, scrutinizing him. "Do you play games?" Samuel chuckled lightly, glancing at Kathleen, who stood watching with nervous anticipation. "I'll try, but I might need some help. I'm not very good at building towers." Ashley grinned, grabbing his hand and pulling him closer to the blocks. "We'll teach you." For the next hour, the room was filled with the sound of tumbling blocks, giggles, and Samuel's deep laughter. He let the girls guide him, his movements careful and deliberate, yet his genuine engagement brought a warmth to the space that Kathleen hadn't realized had been missing. She leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed as she watched them. For the first time in a long while, her heart felt light. Samuel was not merely enduring the girls, he was establishing a deep connection with them, moment by moment. Later that evening, as the girls fell asleep in their shared room, Kathleen found Samuel in the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up as he sipped a glass of wine. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but full of emotion. He turned to her, his gaze softening. "For what?" She expressed her gratitude by spending time with them. "They've been through so much. Seeing them happy, it means everything to me." Samuel leaned against the counter, studying her. "They're remarkable," he said simply. "Strong. Like their mother." Kathleen felt her cheeks warm, and she looked down, fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep them here," she admitted. "With everything that's happened, the media, the pressure, it's too much." Samuel straightened, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "I have a family estate in Porto. It's quiet, secluded. We could go there away from the chaos." Kathleen blinked, surprised. "Porto? It's where I grew up," he explained. "It's peaceful. It's the kind of place where your daughters can simply be themselves, and where you can finally breathe." Her heart swelled at the thought. The idea of leaving the relentless scrutiny behind and starting fresh felt like a lifeline she hadn't realized she needed. But doubt crept in just as quickly. "Samuel, are you sure?" she asked. "This is your home, your world. I don't want to disrupt that." He stepped closer, his voice firm yet kind. "Kathleen, you and your daughters are my world now. If you're willing, I'd like us to make this move together." Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away, nodding. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's do it." The journey to Porto felt like stepping into a dream. The sprawling estate sat nestled among rolling vineyards, the golden light of the Portuguese sun bathing everything in warmth. The girls ran through the gardens with unbridled joy, their laughter echoing across the grounds. Samuel watched them from the terrace, his expression calm but content. Kathleen joined him, a soft smile playing on her lips as she handed him a cup of coffee. "They love it here," she said. "They deserve it," he replied, his gaze lingering on the girls. "And you?" she asked, tilting her head. "Do you miss the city?" Samuel turned to her, a rare smile breaking across his face. "Not at all." As the weeks passed, the four of them settled into a rhythm. Samuel became a fixture in the girls' lives, from reading bedtime stories to teaching them how to navigate the sprawling grounds. Ashley and Amy began to look at him as more than just a visitor. They saw him as a protector, a father figure, Kathleen watched it all unfold, with a mixture of hope and love. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream again. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace under a canopy of stars, Samuel reached for her hand. "I never thought I'd find this," he admitted, his voice low. Kathleen met his gaze, her heart swelling. "Neither did I." For the first time in years, peace wasn't just an idea. It was real, and it was theirs. Together. The air in Porto was fragrant with the scent of blooming flowers, carried on the soft breeze that rustled through the vineyard surrounding Samuel's family estate. Preparations for the wedding were in full swing, and the estate bustled with quiet excitement. Kathleen stood in the living room, watching Ashley and Amy dart around, their laughter filling the space as they admired the white rose garlands strung along the arches outside. "Mummy, are these for the wedding?" Amy inquired, as she held up a delicate flower crown. Kathleen crouched down, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you like them?" Amy nodded, her eyes wide with wonder. "You're going to look like a princess." Kathleen laughed softly, her heart swelling. Maybe just for a day. The ceremony was simple yet elegant, blending Portuguese and American traditions to honor both their journeys. Soft white drapes, fairy lights, and rows of seating transformed the outdoor terrace into a haven, overlooking the sprawling vineyards bathed in golden sunlight. Friends and close family gathered, the intimacy of the occasion reflecting Samuel and Kathleen's desire for a celebration rooted in love, not grandeur. Samuel stood at the altar, his tailored suit accentuating his calm, composed demeanor. But his eyes betrayed him. They softened the moment Kathleen appeared, walking down the aisle in a flowing ivory gown. Ashley and Amy trailed behind her, scattering petals with delighted giggles, their joy infectious. Kathleen's steps were slow and deliberate, as if grounding herself in the reality of the moment. Her gaze locked with Samuel's, and everything else faded away. When she reached him, he took her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. "You look beautiful," he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "And you look like you're pretending not to cry," she teased softly, earning a rare, quiet laugh from him. The vows were heartfelt, spoken with the kind of sincerity that brought tears to many eyes. Samuel's words were steady, but laced with emotion, as he promised to be a husband and father, not just in title, but in action. "I never thought I'd find peace," he admitted, his voice carrying through the hushed crowd. "But with you, Kathleen, and with Ashley and Amy, I've found more than that. I've found home." Kathleen's voice trembled as she spoke, but her resolve never wavered. "You've given us safety, love, and hope. I never dreamed I could feel this way again, and I promise to honor this gift you've given us every day." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel leaned in, his kiss tender, yet filled with unspoken promises. The guests erupted into applause, and Ashley and Amy were the first to rush toward them, hugging their mother and their new father. We held the reception under the stars, setting long tables beneath strings of lights. The meal was a fusion of Portuguese and American dishes, a nod to the union of their worlds. Laughter and music filled the night as guests toasted to love and new beginnings. As the evening wound down, Samuel and Kathleen found a quiet moment away from the crowd, standing at the edge of the vineyard. The moonlight cast a soft glow over the landscape, the gentle hum of conversation fading into the background. Kathleen whispered, "I didn't think I could feel this way again." Samuel turned to her, his expression unguarded. "Neither did I. But with you, with them." He gestured toward the terrace where Ashley and Amy were playing. "Everything feels right." Kathleen rested her head against his shoulder, the weight of years of pain and struggle lifting in the quiet comfort of his presence. As the celebration drew to a close, news arrived that Linda had not only lost her legal battle, but was also facing serious consequences for her actions, including charges related to drug use and workplace misconduct. The vindication was a final note of closure, a reminder that they had moved beyond the chaos and into a life defined by love and resilience. That night, as Samuel and Kathleen sat on the balcony of their bedroom, watching the stars, he reached for her hand. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Kathleen smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "That we've finally found our forever." Samuel brought her hand to his lips, his voice steady. "Forever sounds perfect." And in the quiet serenity of Porto, surrounded by their daughters, their love, and a future full of promise, forever began. The golden sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the waves that lapped gently against the shore near their villa. Ashley and Amy raced ahead, their laughter ringing out over the sound of the ocean. Kathleen watched them with a soft smile, her bare feet sinking into the cool sand as she strolled hand in hand with Samuel. The villa, nestled on a cliff overlooking the water, had quickly become their sanctuary. The chaos of the past seemed a distant memory now, replaced by the rhythm of a simpler, quieter life. The scent of salt and wildflowers filled the air, a perfect accompaniment to the melody of the sea. Ashley turned and waved enthusiastically. "Come on, Mummy. Daddy, you're so slow." Kathleen laughed, the sound light and unburdened. "We're coming," she called back, her fingers tightening around Samuel's. "Daddy," Samuel mused with a faint smile. "That's still new." Kathleen glanced at him, her eyes sparkling. "But it suits you." Samuel's expression softened, and he stopped walking, pulling Kathleen gently toward him. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice low. "What about me?" she replied, tilting her head in question. Samuel hesitated for only a moment before placing his hand gently on her stomach. His gaze was steady, filled with quiet wonder. "You've been glowing lately," he said. "I thought it was the peace we've found here. But it's more than that, isn't it?" Tears sprang to Kathleen's eyes as she nodded, her hand covering his. "It is," she whispered. "I found out a few days ago. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Samuel's face lit up, the rare sight of unguarded joy washing over his features. "We're having a child." "Yes," Kathleen said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Our child." For a moment, they stood there, the world around them fading into the background. Then Samuel leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You've given me everything I never knew I needed," he murmured. Kathleen smiled through her tears. "And you've done the same for me." Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, the family gathered around a small bonfire Samuel had built on the beach. Ashley and Amy roasted marshmallows, their faces glowing in the firelight. "Mummy, when will the baby come?" Amy asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "In a few months," Kathleen replied, running her fingers through Amy's hair. "But you and Ashley will be the first to know when it's time." Ashley grinned. "I want to teach the baby how to build sand castles." "And I'll teach them how to eat marshmallows," Amy continued, eliciting laughter from everyone. Samuel watched the scene, his heart full. He reached for Kathleen's hand, their fingers intertwining effortlessly. "This," he said quietly, his voice carrying over the crackle of the fire. "This is what I've always wanted. A family. A life like this." Kathleen leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Me too," she said softly. The night deepened, the stars appearing one by one in the vast expanse of sky. The girls eventually drifted off to sleep, wrapped in blankets as the fire died down. Samuel carried them back to the villa, their small heads resting against his shoulders. When he returned to the beach, Kathleen was still there, gazing out at the ocean. He sat beside her, the two of them wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the moment. "What do you think the future holds?" Kathleen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel considered her question, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Happiness," he said simply. "Challenges maybe, but together, we'll face it all. This is only the beginning." Kathleen nodded, a content smile playing on her lips. "And it's a beautiful beginning." As the waves lapped at their feet and the stars glittered above, Samuel and Kathleen sat side by side, basking in the peace they had fought so hard to find. Their family, their love, and their future stretched out before them, endless, like the ocean itself. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.